There's something really big happening this week in Canberra. We're talking about what's good for the country and Australians.
We think there's a real opportunity to change some of the settings to make it easier for members to be in a good retirement product. We're actually arguing for more money to not be in the fund and to be in retirees' hands. And that's good for the economy, it's good for productivity, and it's good for community outcomes.
Hello and welcome to Super Insider, a podcast on investing, the economy and superannuation, proudly brought to you by Australian Retirement Trust. My name is Anne Fuchs and I'm your host, and today we have someone very special. He's never been on Super Insider before. He is the chairman of Australian Retirement Trust, Andrew Fraser. Welcome to Super Insider.
Thanks for finally inviting me, Anne.
Finally, we have this man here because there's something happening this week in Canberra called the Treasurer's Economic Reform Roundtable, and Andrew is one of the very few people attending.
I am, so it's a rare privilege to be invited to be in the room for such important discussions that will take place. One of the really cool things about it also is it's in the cabinet room. People might not know it's got some pretty serious security, which you might expect. It has no windows and you're not allowed devices in there. So I'm actually really looking forward to what's going to be a massively important conversation, but I'm also secretly looking forward to not having a phone for 3 days.
Yeah, wow, that sounds very fancy and important. You are wearing many, many hats in this capacity to attend, but I'm just going to put on a hat, listeners and viewers, and remind you that this is general advice, general information only, and you'll need to make sure whether this information is right for you. Now, Andrew, those hats that you might be wearing that have informed why you're invited to the roundtable would be?
So obviously, principally as chair of Australian Retirement Trust, but I also am the Chancellor of Griffith University, which is my
best university ever, and my old university.
Indeed, it's produced some great people.
Yes.
And so being the Chancellor is like being the chair in a sense. I chair also Orange Sky Australia, which is one of the more successful social enterprises set up by a couple of guys who are Young Australians of the Year. And as well, I sit on the board of the Bank of Queensland and the Brisbane Broncos, both of which are listed entities. And I guess it's that sectionality across charities, the education sector and the broader economy, different sectors, different types of organisations, and that broader view, as well as my former background, which is part of the reason that I've been invited.
Now, your former background, just for our listeners and viewers, if you weren't aware, Andrew is the former Treasurer of Queensland. He's a very proud Queenslander, and I know it's Australian Retirement Trust is a fund for all of Australians, but I do enjoy being parochial Queenslander whenever I'm around Andrew because he's a Broncos supporter, a Queensland supporter, and yes, you were the Treasurer of Queensland. So that also gives you a very unique insight into where the reform opportunities could come from.
Yeah, and there's actually another former Treasurer in the room as well, Ben Wyatt, who now serves on a range of boards, who's a fabulous guy from Western Australia. And I think the New South Wales Treasurer will be in the room because he's the chair of the State Treasurers, the Board of Treasurers at the moment. But there's a massive breadth of experience in the room and it's going to be a really important conversation.
Brian Parker and I recorded an episode recently, actually with Andrew Fisher, talking about economic thematics. And we were talking about sluggish productivity. And this is, I guess, why the Treasurer is holding this roundtable. And Australian Retirement Trust put in a submission. There were two key thematics in that we felt would really help boost productivity that all Australians could benefit from. What were they?
One was a big focus on improving the velocity of deployment of public and private capital. And there's a real role that super can play there on both sides of that equation and almost uniquely as a form of capital and being able to improve the time that it takes to get to investment decisions. So a whole theme around approvals and regulatory approvals and time to decision and time to deploy capital is a big part of that, but really also the role that the nature of superannuation capital can play. A great example of that is Amplitel, the digital towers business of Telstra that we're co-invested in that business. That's really important national infrastructure. Try and do anything without a mobile phone these days.
Well, you're looking forward to it, remember?
Well, exactly.
True.
Apparently we're going to solve the problems of the country without a mobile phone.
There you go, old-fashioned.
Apart from that, that's the sort of critical infrastructure. And Telstra there needed someone who was going to be a patient and trustworthy and long-term partner. And that's just the sort of capital that we provide. What's the benefit of that? You've got national infrastructure that's supported with the capital from Australian Retirement Trust alongside the Future Fund, I might add into that. Telstra is able to deploy its capital in different ways. And the capital infrastructure, which is really important to the nation and the growth and the future of the nation, is therefore secured with a really dependent partner. And that's the type of creative capital deployment into nationally significant infrastructure that I think there's real opportunity to grow into the future.
Andrew, one thing I'm really proud of with our submission is that we're not talking about what Art wants. We're talking about what's good for the country. Superannuation is 33 or thereabouts years old, $4 trillion and rapidly growing. And so how can we deploy that money for the good of the country and Australians? And most of our listeners and viewers wouldn't realise that we've been doing nation building for decades. It just hasn't been called that. Airports, ports.
Yeah, exactly. So, we've got positions in the Port of Melbourne and the Port of Brisbane. We've got positions in Sydney Airport and Brisbane Airport. This is all infrastructure that serves the community. And just as importantly, and the precondition is they are good investments that provide good returns to our members. So members' best financial interests are at the forefront of that. And when you can make a good investment that delivers the returns and also supports that type of infrastructure, then we're in a really strong position as a fund, and that helps the fund, it helps our members, and it helps the country.
And I think too, as part of that submission, we are talking about where there's opportunity to streamline regulation, things like stamp duty, things that will actually make it easier for funds to deploy the money.
Yeah, so there's a really big push, I think, in some parts of the globe and certainly in Australia to make sure that regulation is good regulation, not just regulation for regulation's sake. So one of the themes that you might hear is regulating for growth, not just regulating for risk. So what are we actually trying to achieve with levels of regulation? All of that, involves spade work to do. That's not going to all happen next week. But what it does mean is that you're going to get capital deployed at a faster rate, and that's good for the economy, it's good for productivity, and it's good for community outcomes.
Now, the other thing that's good for productivity, we believe, is retirement.
Indeed.
Tell us about that.
Well, as we like to say here at Australian Retirement Trust, retirement is our middle name. And ultimately, we think there's a real opportunity to change some of the settings to make it easier for members to be in a good retirement product. And so we do a lot in the accumulation phase in the super sector in Australia, and that's where the system's grown up. There is a real opportunity to do more in retirement, and we think the capacity to have soft defaults, so people to be moved into retirement products, into pension-based products, which can be advantageous. Obviously, people need to take their own advice, as you said earlier, but there is real opportunity there for individuals, and then the system is better off. What that means also is you're getting money being redeployed back into the economy. And to your earlier point here, we're actually arguing for more money to not be in the fund and to be in retirees' hands. So this isn't about saying we want this fund to be bigger and hang on to the money. Actually, we're arguing the opposite. We're arguing that the money should be easier for it to leave here into the retirees' hands at the point of retirement. And I think there's opportunity to be creative around that.
Many of our listeners and viewers are leading into retirement, in retirement, and they can be overwhelmed with decisions. And when those great visionaries created superannuation, they did create world-class savings. But that final chapter of reform, i.e. how do you start spending it, hasn't really been written so that it's easy for Australians to navigate those decisions about how often I draw down, how much investment risk I take, how long will the money last. And so when you talk about soft default, that's what you're referencing there.
Yeah, absolutely. How do we encourage and support people, given that we've supported them all the way through the savings journey and made a whole series of decisions and prompts for them to be in that point? How do we translate that into retirement? And I think there's an opportunity for the system, there's an opportunity for the country, and there's an opportunity for Australian Retirement Trust.
ART is truly a proxy for Australia due to the diversity of our membership, the employers who trust us to look after their staff. And we do know that many people would rather do anything else but than have a conversation with their super fund. And so therefore what they do is maybe it's a bit of financial self-harm. They'll take their money out when they finish work and just put it in the bank, blow it on some jet skis, take mum to Bali, and then they're living on the age pension, and that sort of fails the purpose of what superannuation was for, and that's an impost on taxpayers, and which is another reason why we're putting forward the idea that retirement reform is important for economic productivity.
Yeah, strong agree on that front, and I think when we've got individuals who are having a better retirement, that's good for them as individuals, but you add all that up together and it's better for the community. And actually, if people are enjoying more of their retirement with greater security, there's actually an economic dividend in that as well. And there's a whole series of things that flow from the amount of money flowing through the economy that supports activity and is good for the economy generally. But it's really kind of the cumulative build of how can individual members be better off, adding that up to a better outcome for the community and a better outcome for the economy. And that means a better outcome for all of Australia. And as Australian Retirement Trust, that's what we support.
So your final message to our listeners and viewers, if like Brian Parker will never give me a prediction. He annoys me to no end. I'm always trying to pin him and he won't do it. So I'm going to see if our chairman will do it, listeners and viewers. Are there any predictions around what might come from this? This is a once in a generation. It's so exciting and inspiring. Do you have any predictions around what might come from this?
I think I can go into the column of hopes or ambitions, and maybe they'll become predictions.
Yeah.
But I do think there's genuine groundswell support for regulatory reform change and things like speeded up approvals, deemed approvals, especially when it comes to major projects and housing. I think the ability to deliver more housing more quickly is something that should be at the forefront of what we do as a country. It's something that we haven't got right as a country. It's a real tragedy in my view. It's an intergenerational tragedy, and I think if we get to the end of Thursday and we've shifted the dial for future generations, then I think the conversation will have been worthwhile. If there's consensus about steps that we can take that improve outcomes for future generations, then I think we're going to have achieved something as a country.
Andrew, certainly all of us at Australian Retirement Trust are cheering you on. And I know the whole superannuation sector is cheering you on because we have such an important role to play for the good of this country. And it's marvellous that that's been recognised by you attending. So will you come back onto Super Insider another time? You can run some commentary on the mighty Bronx, maybe.
Indeed. I'd be very grateful to be invited back to this esteemed podcast, Anne. So I've listened to it many times, and I know you've had lots of superstars on it. So if you found your way to invite me back, I'd be grateful.
Well, look, your schedule is just exhausting to read it. So we're very grateful that you've been able to squeeze us in. To our listeners and viewers, please tell your family and friends, advocate for Super Insider and for them paying attention to their very precious retirement savings. We'll see you again soon.